The dust devil spun lazily across the main street of Redemption Creek, a town that had earned its name through the sheer volume of blood spilled on its weathered wooden sidewalks. It was the kind of place where decent folks crossed the street when they saw trouble coming, and trouble came often in the form of drunk cowboys, desperate outlaws, and men with nothing left to lose but their lives. The morning sun cast long shadows between the ramshackle buildings that lined the street like broken teeth in an old man's skull. The saloon doors swung perpetually in the desert breeze, their hinges screaming like tortured souls. The general store's windows were boarded up after the third robbery in 2 months. Even the church bell had been sold to pay for the preacher's funeral expenses after he tried to break up a fight between claim jumpers and ended up taking a bullet for his trouble. Nobody expected salvation to arrive on the 1047 train from Denver, especially not in the form of a single man carrying a worn leather satchel and wearing a star on his chest that gleamed like a beacon of hope in the morning light. The stranger stepped off the train with the confident stride of a man who'd seen worse towns than Redemption Creek and lived to clean 'em up. He was tall, probably 6 feet 2 inches in his boots, with broad shoulders that filled out his black coat like he'd been born to wear it. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked with the kind of lines that came from squinting into hostile territory and making hard decisions that other men couldn't stomach. But it was his eyes that caught the attention of the few townspeople brave enough to venture onto the street during daylight hours. Steel gray and cold as mountain snow, they held the steady gaze of a man who'd looked death in the face so many times they'd become old acquaintances. Those eyes missed nothing. The broken windows, the bullet holes in the saloon's facade, the way decent women hurried past with their heads down and their children clutched close. The star pinned to his coat was genuine federal silver, bearing the inscription United States Marshal, in letters that had been polished until they caught the light, like promises of justice. The gun on his hip was a Colt Peacemaker with ivory grips, worn smooth by years of use, but maintained with the kind of care that suggested its owner knew exactly how to use it when words failed to solve problems. He introduced himself to Mayor Henderson as Marshal William Cade, sent by the territorial government to restore order to Redemption Creek after reports of escalating violence had reached the federal courts in Denver. His credentials were impeccable. Signed papers bearing official seals, letters of introduction from territorial judges, and a reputation that preceded him from cleaned-up towns across 3 states. The mayor, a nervous little man who jumped at shadows and hadn't slept well since the last sheriff had been found face down in the horse trough with 6 bullets in his back, welcomed Marshal Cade like a drowning man embraces driftwood. The town council, what remained of it after 2 members had been shot in disputes over mining claims, voted unanimously to give the new marshal whatever support he needed to restore peace to their troubled community. What they didn't know, what nobody could have guessed from looking at the confident lawman who'd stepped off that morning train, was that Marshal William Cade had died 3 years ago in a shootout with bank robbers outside Cheyenne. The man wearing his identity was someone else entirely, someone whose real name appeared on wanted posters from California to the Mississippi, someone who'd built a reputation that made hardened outlaws cross themselves and pray for deliverance. The man calling himself William Cade was actually Clayton Black Jack Morrison, the most wanted outlaw in 7 territories and the leader of the gang that had terrorized the frontier for over a decade. He was a killer, a thief, a man who'd robbed banks and trains and murdered anyone who stood in his way. His gang had pulled off the largest bank robbery in Colorado history, stolen Army payrolls, and left a trail of bodies across the American West that stretched longer than most men's shadows. But Black Jack Morrison was a dead man walking, hunted by federal marshals, Pinkerton detectives, and bounty hunters who dreamed of collecting the $5,000 reward on his head. His own gang had turned on him after a job went bad in New Mexico, forcing him to kill 3 of his former partners in a running gunfight that left him wounded and alone in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back and a desperate need to disappear forever. That's when he'd stumbled across the real Marshal Cade's body in a canyon outside Pueblo, killed by Apaches who'd stripped the corpse but left behind the marshal's identification papers and badge. In that moment of discovery, Black Jack Morrison had seen not just a dead lawman, but a chance for redemption, or at least survival. He'd buried Morrison's identity in that canyon along with the marshal's bones and walked away as William Cade, carrying forged credentials that would pass any casual inspection. The transformation hadn't been complete overnight. Morrison had spent months studying the law, learning the procedures and protocols that real marshals followed. He'd read legal books by firelight, memorized territorial statutes, and practiced the kind of measured authority that separated lawmen from the outlaws they pursued. Most importantly, he'd learned to see crimes from the victim's perspective rather than the perpetrator's, understanding for the first time the real cost of the violence he'd once dispensed so casually. Now, standing on the dusty street of Redemption Creek with a badge on his chest instead of a price on his head, the man who had been Black Jack Morrison was about to discover whether a lifetime of crime could be transformed into a force for justice. The irony wasn't lost on him. The most wanted outlaw in the territories was about to become the law in a town that desperately needed both protection and redemption. His first day as marshal began before dawn, when gunshots erupted from the Silver Dollar Saloon like thunder rolling across the desert. By the time Cade reached the establishment, 3 men lay dead on the sawdust-covered floor, victims of a dispute over a poker game that had escalated beyond reason. The survivors were drunk, belligerent, and heavily armed, exactly the kind of situation that had claimed the life of the previous sheriff. But Marshal Cade didn't approach the scene like a typical lawman. He moved with the predatory grace of someone who'd been on both sides of such confrontations, reading the body language and tactical positions of the armed men with an expertise born from years of similar situations. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd killed professionally and understood exactly how quickly violence could escalate. Instead of demanding surrender or threatening arrest, Cade simply stood in the doorway and waited. His presence filled the saloon like smoke from a range fire, drawing every eye to the badge on his chest and the gun on his hip. The drunken arguments died away as men realized they were facing something different from the weak-willed lawmen who tried and failed to tame Redemption Creek in the past. One of the survivors, a grizzled prospector named Dutch Henderson, who had been known to shoot men for looking at him wrong, decided to test the new marshal's resolve. He went for his gun with the confidence of a man who'd never been outdrawn, but his hand never reached the grip before Cade's peacemaker materialized in his palm like deadly magic. The shot that followed wasn't aimed to kill, but to educate. Cade's bullet took Dutch's gun clean out of his hand, shattering the weapon and sending the prospector stumbling backward into the bar with blood streaming from his suddenly empty fingers. The message was clear to everyone in the saloon. This marshal could have killed Dutch as easily as disarming him, and the choice to show mercy was a demonstration of strength rather than weakness. The other armed men in the saloon suddenly found pressing reasons to be elsewhere. Within minutes, the silver dollar was empty, except for the new marshal, the bartender, and 3 corpses that would need burying. But more importantly, word of the encounter spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire, carrying news that the new lawman was something special, fast enough to outdraw Dutch Henderson, accurate enough to shoot a gun from a man's hand, and controlled enough to choose mercy over murder. That afternoon, Cade established his office in the abandoned jail that had stood empty since the last sheriff's death. The building was in worse condition than he'd expected. Broken windows, a leaking roof, and cells that wouldn't hold a determined drunk, much less a serious criminal. But the location was perfect, positioned at the intersection of the town's 2 main streets with clear lines of sight in all directions. Working with his own money and donated materials from grateful townspeople, Cade began transforming the neglected jail into a proper seat of justice. He replaced the broken windows with heavy shutters that could stop bullets, reinforced the cell doors with steel bars salvaged from abandoned mines, and installed a gun rack that held enough weapons to outfit a small army. More importantly, he began establishing the routines and procedures that would transform Redemption Creek from a lawless frontier town into a civilized community. He posted notices outlining the new rules. No guns in public buildings, no fighting in the streets, no threatening behavior toward women or merchants. The penalties were clearly stated and uniformly enforced, regardless of a man's wealth, connections, or reputation. The first test of these new laws came within a week, when Black Pete Kowalski rode into town with his gang of cattle rustlers. Kowalski had been terrorizing ranchers throughout the territory, stealing livestock and burning out anyone who resisted. He was a big man, well over 6 feet tall and built like a grizzly bear, with arms like tree trunks and hands that had strangled more than one victim to death. When Kowalski swaggered into the Silver Dollar Saloon with his 6-man crew, everyone expected a repeat of the violence that had plagued Redemption Creek for months. The Rustler King made no secret of his intentions, announcing loudly that he planned to take whatever he wanted from the town and kill anyone who objected. His men spread out through the saloon, hands resting on their weapons, as they waited for the inevitable confrontation. Marshal Cade arrived within minutes, alerted by the sudden exodus of terrified townspeople from the saloon district. But instead of bursting through the doors with guns blazing, he positioned himself across the street and simply waited. His patience was that of a hunter who'd learned that the right moment was worth more than rushed action, and his stillness carried more menace than any amount of bluster or threats. The psychological pressure of the marshal's presence began to work on Kowalski's men almost immediately. They could see him through the saloon windows, standing motionless in the street like a statue of vengeance, and their nerve began to crack under the weight of his unwavering attention. One by one, they found excuses to slip out the back door and disappear into the maze of alleys behind the main street. When Kowalski finally emerged to face the marshal, he was alone except for his lieutenant, a knife-wielding killer named Scarface Tommy, who'd murdered 3 men in Dodge City before fleeing west. The Rustler King expected intimidation tactics, verbal threats, or maybe a challenge to single combat. What he got instead was something far more unsettling. Cade simply looked at him, those steel-gray eyes cataloging every detail of Kowalski's appearance, every weapon he carried, every tactical advantage or weakness in his position. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, filled with the kind of tension that made lesser men break into cold sweats and reach for their guns prematurely. When the marshal finally spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. He informed Kowalski that he had exactly 1 minute to mount his horse and ride out of Redemption Creek, never to return. The alternative was a grave in the town cemetery next to the other men who'd thought they were tougher than the law. Kowalski's response was predictable. He went for his gun with the roaring bravado of a man who'd never been seriously challenged. But the draw that had served him well against frightened ranchers and inexperienced lawmen was pathetically slow compared to the lightning-fast motion that brought Cade's peacemaker into action. The marshal's first shot took Kowalski in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own weapon flying into the dust. The second shot, fired before the Rustler King could recover his balance, shattered his right kneecap and dropped him screaming to the wooden sidewalk. Scarface Tommy, seeing his boss writhing in agony, decided discretion was the better part of valor, and disappeared into the crowd of spectators. But Cade wasn't finished with his demonstration. Standing over the wounded rustler, he delivered a speech that would be remembered and repeated throughout the territory for years to come. He explained that Kowalski was being allowed to live as an example to other would-be troublemakers, but that the next man who threatened the peace of Redemption Creek wouldn't be shown such mercy. The Rustler King, his face pale with shock and pain, was loaded onto a wagon and escorted to the town limits with strict instructions never to return. Word of his defeat spread quickly through the outlaw community, carrying the message that Redemption Creek was now under the protection of a marshal who couldn't be intimidated, bribed, or defeated in a fair fight. Over the following months, Marshal Cade systematically dismantled the criminal infrastructure that had made Redemption Creek a haven for outlaws and desperados. He tracked down the horse thieves who'd been operating out of Hidden Canyon, capturing 3 and killing 2 others. In a running gunfight that lasted the better part of a day, he broke up the illegal gambling operation that had been cheating travelers and cowboys out of their hard-earned money, arresting the operators and returning the stolen funds to their rightful owners. Most impressively, he ended the reign of terror imposed by the Crimson Valley Gang, a group of murderers and rapists who'd been using the town as a base for their operations throughout the territory. The confrontation took place on a moonless night in October, when Cade tracked the gang to their hideout in the abandoned silver mine outside town. The battle that followed was like something from a military campaign rather than typical frontier law enforcement. Cade used tactics learned during his years as an outlaw to outmaneuver and outfight men who considered themselves professionals in the art of violence. He moved through the mine tunnels like a ghost, using his intimate knowledge of criminal thinking to predict and counter every move his opponents made. By dawn, 5 members of the Crimson Valley Gang were dead, and their leader was chained in Cade's jail awaiting transport to the territorial prison. The victory established the Marshal's reputation throughout the region as a lawman who could handle any threat, no matter how dangerous or well organized. But perhaps more importantly, Cade began working to build the kind of community infrastructure that would prevent crime from taking root again in Redemption Creek. He organized a volunteer fire department to protect against the suspicious blazes that had claimed several businesses. He established regular patrols to ensure that travelers could pass through town safely. He even convinced the territorial government to fund improvements to the main road, making it easier for legitimate commerce to flourish. The transformation of Redemption Creek was nothing short of miraculous. Within 6 months of Marshal Cade's arrival, the town had gone from a lawless frontier settlement to a thriving community where families felt safe walking the streets after dark. New businesses opened every month, drawn by the promise of stable, secure conditions for commerce. The population doubled as word spread that Redemption Creek had become a place where honest folks could build decent lives. The local newspaper, which had suspended publication after its editor was shot by claim jumpers, resumed operations and began chronicling the town's remarkable renaissance. Churches that had stood empty for years suddenly found their pews filled with grateful residents who'd rediscovered their faith in human decency. The school, which had been closed for lack of teachers willing to risk their lives in a lawless town, reopened with enthusiasm and strong community support. Mayor Henderson, who'd aged visibly during the dark months before Cade's arrival, seemed to shed years as he watched his town transform into the kind of community he dreamed of leading. The town council expanded from 3 terrified members to 7 confident leaders who worked openly to improve conditions for all residents. Property values increased as people invested in permanent improvements rather than temporary shelters designed for quick abandonment. Marshal Cade became more than just a law enforcement officer. He evolved into the spiritual center of Redemption Creek's rebirth. His office served as an unofficial community center where disputes were mediated before they could escalate into violence. His evening patrols became social occasions where townspeople could approach him with concerns or suggestions for further improvements. The children, who'd once cowered indoors at the first sign of trouble, now played openly in the streets under the watchful protection of a man who dedicated himself to ensuring their safety. Women could visit the general store or attend church services without fear of harassment or assault. Merchants displayed their goods with confidence that theft and vandalism were things of the past. But beneath this remarkable success story, the man who called himself Marshal William Cade carried a burden of secrets that grew heavier with each passing day. Every act of heroism, every moment of genuine service to the community deepened his understanding of the lives he'd destroyed during his years as Black Jack Morrison. The faces of his victims haunted his dreams, reminding him that no amount of good deeds could truly balance the scales of justice. The letters he received from territorial headquarters praising his work felt like accusations rather than commendations. The grateful thanks of townspeople who credited him with saving their lives and livelihoods cut like knives through his conscience. He'd created an identity built on deception, and every day that deception continued was another lie told to people who trusted him with their lives. The psychological strain of maintaining his false identity while genuinely trying to serve justice began taking its toll. Cade found himself checking and rechecking his credentials, rehearsing his backstory, and constantly watching for signs that someone might recognize Black Jack Morrison beneath the marshal's badge. The paranoia that had kept him alive as an outlaw now threatened to destroy the peace he'd found in legitimate service. Sleep became elusive as nightmares plagued his rest, visions of past victims demanding justice and former gang members seeking revenge. He began experiencing moments of disorientation where he wasn't sure which identity was real: the reformed outlaw trying to make amends, or the dedicated lawman serving his community. The line between William Cade and Black Jack Morrison blurred until he sometimes forgot which name to answer to. The crisis came to a head on a cold morning in late November, when the 1047 train from Denver brought an unwelcome passenger to Redemption Creek. Deputy United States Marshal James Crawford stepped onto the platform with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested official business of the most serious nature. He was a tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair and the steady eyes of someone who'd spent years tracking criminals across hostile territory. Crawford's reputation preceded him throughout the frontier territories. He was known as a relentless investigator who never gave up on a case, a man who'd brought in more wanted fugitives than any other federal officer west of the Mississippi. His methods were thorough, his instincts were legendary, and his arrest record was unblemished by corruption or compromise. The deputy marshal's first stop was the Silver Dollar Saloon, where he quietly questioned bartenders, patrons, and working girls about the mysterious transformation of Redemption Creek. His inquiries were subtle but thorough, seeking information about Marshal Cade's background, his methods, and any inconsistencies in his story that might warrant further investigation. Word of Crawford's presence spread through Redemption Creek like smoke from a grass fire, carried by whispers and worried glances. The townspeople, who'd grown to love and respect their marshal, began expressing concerns about federal interference in their local affairs. They'd seen enough corrupt officials to be suspicious of any outside authority that might threaten the peace and prosperity they'd worked so hard to achieve. But Crawford's investigation wasn't motivated by political concerns or territorial disputes. He'd been sent to Redemption Creek because the real Marshal William Cade's widow had been trying to locate her husband's grave for the past 3 years. Official records showed that Cade had been assigned to clean up various frontier towns, but he'd never reported back to headquarters after his assignment in Colorado. The man calling himself Cade had submitted reports and received commendations, but nobody in the territorial government had actually seen him since he'd supposedly taken the job in Redemption Creek. The investigation began innocuously enough, with Crawford reviewing official correspondence and interviewing town officials about their experiences with the marshal. The paperwork was impeccable, the testimonials were glowing, and the results spoke for themselves. By every measurable standard, Marshal William Cade had performed his duties with distinction and transformed a lawless frontier town into a model community. But Crawford's trained instincts detected subtle inconsistencies that wouldn't have been apparent to casual observers. The marshal's signature had evolved over time, suggesting either a deliberate change in handwriting or a different person signing the documents. His knowledge of federal procedures was comprehensive, but seemed recently acquired rather than the product of years of experience. Most tellingly, his tactics and methods bore striking similarities to techniques used by certain criminal organizations rather than traditional law enforcement approaches. The deputy marshal began conducting discreet interviews with longtime residents who might have known the real William Cade from his previous assignments. He studied wanted posters and criminal files, looking for patterns that might connect the mysterious marshal to unsolved crimes or missing persons cases. His investigation was methodical and professional, but it was also closing in on the truth like a noose tightening around a condemned man's neck. Meanwhile, the man living as Marshal Cade watched Crawford's investigation with growing anxiety and desperation. He recognized the signs of a thorough criminal investigation, having been the subject of similar pursuits during his outlaw years. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to abandon Redemption Creek before Crawford could gather enough evidence to expose his true identity. But running would mean abandoning the people who'd come to depend on his protection. It would mean leaving Mayor Henderson vulnerable to the next wave of criminal activity that was sure to follow his departure. It would mean condemning the children who played safely in the streets to return to lives of fear and uncertainty. More than that, running would mean abandoning the only identity he'd ever found that gave his life meaning and purpose. For the first time in his adult life, he was using his skills and abilities to protect the innocent rather than prey upon them. The satisfaction he found in genuine service to his community was deeper and more rewarding than any treasure he'd ever stolen or any victory he'd ever won through violence. The internal struggle between self-preservation and duty consumed his thoughts as Crawford's investigation grew more focused and threatening. He found himself rehearsing explanations and alibis, preparing for the confrontation that seemed inevitable. At the same time, he continued performing his duties as marshal with the same dedication and professionalism that had earned him the community's trust and respect. The breaking point came during the first week of December, when Crawford requested a private meeting to discuss certain discrepancies in the marshal's service record. The deputy marshal's tone was polite but firm, suggesting that cooperation would be appreciated but wasn't optional. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning at the federal courthouse in the county seat, a 2-hour ride from Redemption Creek. That night, as snow began falling on the sleeping town he'd sworn to protect, the man who called himself Marshal William Cade faced the most important decision of his life. He could flee into the wilderness, using his knowledge of criminal tactics to evade capture and disappear forever into the vast American frontier. Or he could face Crawford's investigation with whatever dignity remained to him, accepting responsibility for his past crimes while trying to protect the community he'd learned to love. The choice, when it came, surprised him with its clarity and finality. Instead of running or preparing elaborate deceptions, he spent his last night as marshal writing letters to the people who'd trusted him with their lives and safety. He wrote to Mayor Henderson, explaining the truth about his identity, while urging him to continue the work of building Redemption Creek into the kind of community where families could thrive. He wrote to the town council, providing detailed recommendations for maintaining law and order in his absence. Most importantly, he wrote a complete confession of his crimes as Black Jack Morrison, accepting full responsibility for the murders, robberies, and other acts of violence he'd committed during his outlaw years. The confession included information about stolen property that could be returned to rightful owners, testimony about other criminals who deserved prosecution, and a detailed account of how he'd assumed Marshal Cade's identity. But the confession also included something else, a passionate defense of the work he'd done in Redemption Creek, and a plea that his crimes not be allowed to overshadow the genuine good he'd accomplished. He'd broken federal laws by assuming a false identity, but he'd also saved lives, protected the innocent, and transformed a lawless town into a beacon of civilization on the frontier. The next morning, as Deputy Marshal Crawford waited at the courthouse for a meeting that would never take place, the man who'd been both Black Jack Morrison and Marshal William Cade walked into the Silver Dollar Saloon for the last time. The early morning crowd fell silent as he approached the bar, sensing something different in his demeanor. Without preamble or explanation, he removed the marshal's badge from his coat and placed it on the bar beside his untouched whiskey. The Silver Star caught the morning light streaming through the windows, gleaming like a promise that had been kept despite impossible odds. His final act as marshal was to walk through Redemption Creek one last time, checking on the businesses and families he'd protected, ensuring that his departure wouldn't leave them vulnerable to immediate threats. The townspeople who saw him during this farewell tour sensed that something momentous was happening, but none dared to interrupt what felt like a sacred ritual. By noon, the man who'd been Marshal William Cade was gone, riding north toward the mountains on a horse that had belonged to one of the criminals he'd captured months earlier. He left behind no forwarding address, no explanation for his sudden departure, and no indication of where he might be heading. Deputy Marshal Crawford arrived in Redemption Creek that afternoon to find the town in a state of confused mourning. The marshal's office was unlocked, his personal effects were gone, and the badge that had represented law and order for 6 transformative months was lying on the Silver Dollar's bar like a discarded dream. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the deception that had been practiced on the unsuspecting community. The real William Cade had been dead for years, killed by Apache raiders in Colorado and buried in an unmarked grave. The man who'd served as Redemption Creek's marshal was actually Black Jack Morrison, one of the most wanted criminals in federal history. But the investigation also revealed something else, a crime rate that had dropped to virtually zero, a community that had been transformed from lawless chaos to peaceful prosperity, and a population that mourned the loss of their protector despite learning about his criminal past. The letters Morrison had left behind provided enough evidence to solve dozens of unsolved crimes and recover thousands of dollars in stolen property. The federal authorities faced an unprecedented dilemma. They had clear evidence that Black Jack Morrison had committed serious federal crimes, but they also had to acknowledge that his work as marshal had been exemplary by every legal and ethical standard. He'd saved lives, protected property, and served justice with a dedication that many legitimate lawmen couldn't match. The case became a subject of intense debate in legal and political circles throughout the territories. Some argued that Morrison's criminal past made his service as marshal invalid. that a man who'd built his reputation on violence and theft couldn't legitimately serve as a protector of law and order. Others contended that his transformation and service had earned him the right to redemption, that judging him solely on his past crimes ignored the genuine good he'd accomplished. The people of Redemption Creek had no such moral ambiguity about their former marshal. At a town meeting called to discuss the revelations about Morrison's identity, the vote was unanimous. He would always be remembered as the man who'd saved their community, regardless of what name he'd used or what crimes he'd committed before arriving on the morning train from Denver. Mayor Henderson summed up the community's feelings in a statement that was reprinted in newspapers throughout the West. He acknowledged that they'd been deceived about their marshal's identity, but he insisted that they'd never been deceived about his character or his commitment to their safety and welfare. The man they'd known as William Cade had risked his life repeatedly to protect them, and no revelation about his past could change that fundamental truth. The search for Black Jack Morrison continued for months, led by federal marshals and bounty hunters who scoured the territories for any trace of the vanished outlaw. Some claimed to have spotted him in mining camps throughout Colorado and Wyoming. Others reported sightings in cattle towns along the Kansas border. A few insisted he'd fled to Mexico or California, seeking sanctuary in places where his reputation might provide protection rather than persecution. But the man who'd been both Morrison and Cade had seemingly vanished as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. No confirmed sightings, no credible reports, no evidence that he was still alive anywhere in the American West. He disappeared into legend, becoming the subject of stories told around campfires and in saloons throughout the frontier. Some claimed he'd been killed by bounty hunters who'd kept his death secret to avoid sharing the reward money. Others insisted he'd started a new life under yet another assumed identity, perhaps serving as a lawman in some distant territory where his reputation hadn't preceded him. A few romantic souls suggested he'd found love and settled down to a quiet life as a rancher or businessman, finally achieving the peace that had eluded him during his years of crime and service. The truth, as is often the case with legends, was both simpler and more complex than any of the stories that grew around his disappearance. The man who'd been Black Jack Morrison had indeed found a form of peace, but it wasn't the kind that comes from comfortable retirement or romantic fulfillment. High in the Colorado Rockies, where the air was thin and the winters were long enough to discourage casual visitors, a small cabin sat in a clearing overlooking a valley that few men had ever seen. The cabin's single occupant was a man who called himself John Smith when he had occasion to speak to the rare trappers or prospectors who passed through the area. To these occasional visitors, John Smith appeared to be just another hermit seeking solitude in the wilderness. He was polite but distant, helpful to travelers in need, but careful not to encourage extended conversation. His cabin was well maintained, his small garden was productive, and his survival skills were obviously extensive. But there was something in his eyes that suggested depths of experience that didn't match his simple mountain lifestyle. The truth was that the man calling himself John Smith spent his days in quiet contemplation of the life he'd lived and the choices he'd made. The isolation he'd chosen wasn't an escape from justice, but a form of self-imposed exile, a recognition that some crimes were too serious to be balanced by good deeds, no matter how sincere or beneficial those deeds might be. He'd brought with him to the mountains a collection of books on law, philosophy, and ethics, spending his long winter evenings trying to understand the moral complexities of his situation. He read accounts of other men who'd tried to redeem themselves through service, studied religious texts that dealt with forgiveness and atonement, and wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. The money he'd stolen during his outlaw years remained hidden in various caches throughout the territories, untouched and slowly being forgotten as the landmarks that marked their locations eroded or disappeared. He'd considered returning the stolen funds anonymously, but realized that doing so might lead investigators back to his hiding place and endanger the peaceful existence he'd found in the mountains. Instead, he began sending anonymous donations to churches, schools, and charitable organizations throughout the West, using intermediaries and complex arrangements to ensure the money couldn't be traced back to him. The donations were substantial, but not large enough to attract attention, funding everything from orphanages to hospitals to schools for children whose parents had been killed by men like the one he'd once been. The work gave him a sense of purpose and a way to use his ill-gotten wealth for legitimate good, but it couldn't ease the fundamental guilt that consumed his thoughts during the quiet hours before dawn. He'd killed innocent people during his outlaw years, destroyed families, and spread terror throughout the territories. No amount of anonymous charity could bring back the dead or heal the wounds he'd inflicted on countless victims. But he'd also saved lives during his months as marshal, protected families from the kind of violence he'd once perpetrated, and given a community the chance to grow and prosper in peace. The moral calculus was complex beyond easy resolution, involving questions of justice, redemption, and the possibility of meaningful change in human nature. As the years passed in his mountain exile, the man who'd been both Black Jack Morrison and Marshal William Cade aged into someone who might have been unrecognizable to either of his former identities. The violence and desperation that had defined his outlaw years gave way to quiet reflection and genuine remorse. The righteous authority he'd exercised as marshal evolved into humble acceptance of his limitations and failures. He remained a wanted man in the eyes of federal law, subject to arrest and prosecution if his identity were ever discovered. But he'd also become something else, a living example of the possibility that even the most hardened criminals might find genuine redemption through service and sacrifice, even if that redemption came at the cost of everything they'd worked to build. The legend of Marshal William Cade continued to grow in Redemption Creek, where annual celebrations commemorated the 6 months when their community had been transformed from chaos to prosperity. A statue was erected in the town square, depicting a stern-faced lawman with a badge on his chest and justice in his eyes. The inscription read simply, "To the marshal who saved our town, identity unknown, service unforgotten." Children who'd been born after his departure grew up hearing stories of the mysterious lawman who'd appeared when he was needed most and vanished when his work was done. They learned that true heroism sometimes required personal sacrifice, that justice could be served by flawed men seeking redemption, and that the measure of a man's worth lay in his actions rather than his past. Meanwhile, federal authorities continued to carry Black Jack Morrison on their active wanted lists. though the intensity of the search diminished as other criminals demanded attention and resources. Bounty hunters occasionally claimed to have new leads or promising information, but none ever produced credible evidence of his whereabouts or activities. The case became a subject of study in law schools and police academies, used to illustrate the complex relationship between justice and redemption in American frontier society. Legal scholars debated whether Morrison's service as marshal should be considered a mitigating factor if he were ever captured and tried for his crimes. Ethicists argued about whether society had a right to demand punishment from someone who demonstrated genuine reform and contributed meaningfully to the public good. But these academic debates had little relevance to the man living in quiet exile in the Colorado mountains. He'd found his own form of justice in the solitude and reflection that marked his days, accepting responsibility for his crimes while continuing to seek ways to balance the scales through anonymous service to others. His story became part of the mythology of the American West, a tale of transformation and redemption that captured the imagination of people who understood that the frontier had always been a place where men could reinvent themselves, for better or worse. The fact that his true fate remained unknown only added to the legend's power, allowing people to imagine their own endings to a story that defied simple moral categorization. Some preferred to believe he'd found peace and happiness in his mountain retreat, that his years of exile had earned him the right to quiet contentment away from the violence and chaos of his former life. Others insisted that justice demanded he face trial for his crimes, regardless of his subsequent service to Redemption Creek or his apparent reformation. The truth, as it often is with legends, lay somewhere between these extremes. In the spring of his 7th year in the mountains, the man who'd once been Black Jack Morrison received an unexpected visitor. She was a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, with the kind of determined expression that suggested she'd traveled a long way for a very specific purpose. Her clothes were practical rather than fashionable, designed for hard travel rather than social impression, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd learned to take care of herself in hostile territory. She introduced herself as Catherine Morrison, his niece, the daughter of the brother he'd killed during their final confrontation in New Mexico 7 years earlier. The brother who'd tried to turn him in for the bounty money, forcing a gunfight that had left one more family member dead and added another layer of guilt to Black Jack's already heavy conscience. Catherine had spent 3 years tracking him down, following rumors and legends across the territories until she'd finally located the hermit in the mountains who matched her uncle's description. She hadn't come seeking revenge or justice in any legal sense. Instead, she'd come seeking answers to questions that had haunted her family since her father's death. The conversation that followed stretched across several days, marked by long silences and careful revelations, as two people who'd been shaped by violence tried to understand the complex legacy of choices made in desperation and anger. Catherine learned about her uncle's transformation from outlaw to lawman, about his service to Redemption Creek, and about the guilt that had driven him into self-imposed exile. More importantly, she learned about her father's final months when he'd been consumed by greed and the desire for easy money that had ultimately led to his death. Black Jack had never wanted to kill his own brother, but Tommy Morrison had given him no choice when he'd decided that family loyalty was worth less than a bounty reward. The revelation that her father had been planning to betray his own brother for money was devastating to Catherine, who'd spent years idealizing Tommy Morrison as a victim of his brother's criminal violence. Understanding the full context of their final confrontation didn't excuse Black Jack's crimes, but it helped her comprehend the impossible situation that had led to her father's death. In return, Catherine provided her uncle with news of the family members who'd survived his outlaw years, information about cousins and distant relatives who'd tried to distance themselves from the Morrison name after Black Jack's crimes had made it synonymous with violence and terror throughout the West. She also brought word of the federal investigation that continued to seek his capture, though with diminished intensity as newer criminals demanded attention and resources. The reward on his head had been increased to $7,000, but active pursuit had been scaled back due to lack of credible leads or reliable sightings. Most significantly, Catherine revealed that she'd visited Redemption Creek during her search for her uncle and had spoken with the people whose lives he'd touched during his months as marshal. Their testimonials about his character and service had convinced her that the man she was seeking bore little resemblance to the monster she'd imagined during her years of anger and grief. The stories she'd heard in Redemption Creek painted a picture of a lawman who'd risked his life repeatedly to protect innocent people, who'd transformed a lawless town into a thriving community, and who'd disappeared rather than allow his past crimes to taint the good work he'd accomplished. These weren't the actions of the heartless killer she'd expected to find, but rather those of a man genuinely seeking redemption through service to others. Their conversations extended beyond family history and personal grievances to encompass larger questions about justice, redemption, and the possibility of meaningful change in human nature. Catherine had received a college education, unusual for a woman of her era, and she brought an intellectual perspective to moral questions that her uncle had been wrestling with in solitude. She helped him understand that his guilt and self-imposed exile, while understandable, might actually be preventing him from making the kind of meaningful amends that could truly honor his victims' memories. Hiding in the mountains allowed him to avoid further harm, but it also prevented him from using his unique skills and experience to protect other innocent people who might benefit from his service. The argument wasn't that his crimes should be forgotten or forgiven, but rather that his remaining years might be better spent in active service to others rather than passive contemplation of past failures. The people of Redemption Creek had demonstrated that his value as a protector could outweigh his history as a destroyer, at least in the eyes of those who benefited from his protection. Catherine's visit forced him to confront questions he'd been avoiding during his years of mountain solitude. Was his exile really about accepting responsibility for his crimes, or was it actually a form of self-indulgent despair that prevented him from making meaningful contributions to society? Did he owe it to his victims to spend his remaining years in hiding, or would they be better honored by his continued efforts to protect other innocent people? The questions had no easy answers, but Catherine's presence provided him with a perspective he had lacked during his years of isolation. She represented the possibility of redemption not through self-punishment, but through continued service to others who needed protection from the kind of violence he'd once perpetrated. When she prepared to leave after a week of intense conversation, Catherine made a proposal that would change the course of both their lives. She'd been working as a teacher in frontier communities, moving from town to town to provide education in places where qualified instructors were rare and desperately needed. Her travels had shown her dozens of communities that needed the kind of protection her uncle had provided to Redemption Creek. Her suggestion was that they work together, with her teaching credentials providing legitimate cover for his law enforcement activities. She could identify communities that needed help, establish their residents as educators, and provide the social connections that would allow him to operate effectively while maintaining a low profile. It wasn't a perfect solution. He would still be a wanted man, still vulnerable to recognition and arrest if his identity were discovered. But it would allow him to use his skills in service of others, rather than waste them in solitude, and it would provide Catherine with the protection she needed to continue her own mission of bringing education to frontier settlements. The proposal represented a fundamental choice between continued exile and active engagement with the world he'd tried to leave behind. Accepting meant risking capture and prosecution, but it also meant the possibility of saving lives and protecting communities that desperately needed experienced law enforcement. After days of consideration, he made his choice with the same finality that had marked his decision to stay and fight for Redemption Creek, rather than flee when Deputy Marshal Crawford had arrived to investigate his identity. The man who'd been Black Jack Morrison and Marshal William Cade would emerge from his mountain exile, but this time as John Morrison, traveling educator and unofficial protector of frontier communities. The transformation required careful planning and preparation. New identity papers had to be obtained through the same criminal networks he'd once used as an outlaw, though now for protective rather than predatory purposes. His appearance had to be altered sufficiently to avoid recognition by bounty hunters or federal agents who might be familiar with his description. Most importantly, he had to develop a new approach to law enforcement that didn't rely on official authority or legal recognition. He couldn't pin on a badge or claim federal jurisdiction, but he could still use his skills to protect innocent people from the kind of criminals he'd once been. The partnership that developed between John Morrison and his niece, Catherine, was unlike anything either had experienced in their previous lives. She provided legitimate cover for their activities, establishing schools and community programs that created natural opportunities for him to identify and address security threats. He provided protection for her educational missions, ensuring that she could work safely in communities where single women faced significant dangers. Their first assignment together was in a mining camp called Silver Falls, where a gang of claim jumpers had been terrorizing prospectors and murdering anyone who resisted their extortion demands. The local sheriff was either corrupt or incompetent, and the territorial government seemed uninterested in protecting the rights of independent miners. Catherine arrived in Silver Falls as a traveling teacher, offering to establish classes for the miners' children and adult literacy programs for workers who'd never had educational opportunities. Her presence provided John with the perfect cover for investigating the criminal activities that were plaguing the camp. The claim jumpers were professionals, well-organized and ruthless in their methods. They'd murdered at least 6 miners in the past 3 months, always making the deaths appear to be accidents or the result of personal disputes. Their leader was a man called Colorado Pete, a former cavalry sergeant who'd been dishonorably discharged for murdering civilians during Indian campaigns. John's investigation revealed that the gang was being protected by corrupt officials in the territorial government, men who were receiving percentages of the stolen claims in exchange for their willingness to ignore criminal activities. The corruption extended high enough that traditional law enforcement approaches were unlikely to succeed. The solution he developed drew on his years of experience as both criminal and lawman, using tactics that operated outside legal channels while still serving justice. Rather than confronting the gang directly, he began a systematic campaign of psychological warfare designed to turn them against each other and destroy their organization from within. Anonymous messages revealed to gang members that their leader was planning to eliminate them after the current operation was complete. False evidence suggested that certain members were planning to betray the organization to federal authorities. Carefully staged incidents made it appear that former victims were seeking supernatural revenge from beyond the grave. The campaign was subtle but devastating in its effectiveness. Within 2 months, Colorado Pete's gang had destroyed itself through suspicion, betrayal, and internal violence. The leader himself was found dead in his cabin, apparently killed by his own lieutenant in a dispute over missing money. The surviving gang members fled the territory, leaving Silver Falls free from the criminal predation that had terrorized it for months. More importantly, John's investigation had gathered enough evidence to expose the corrupt officials who'd been protecting the claim jumpers. Anonymous packages containing detailed documentation of their crimes were delivered to honest federal agents, resulting in arrests and prosecutions that cleaned up the territorial government's involvement in criminal activities. The success in Silver Falls established a pattern that John and Catherine would follow for the next several years, moving from community to community, where her educational mission provided cover for his protective activities. They operated in the shadows of official law enforcement, handling cases that were too complex, too dangerous, or too politically sensitive for conventional approaches. Their methods were unorthodox, but consistently effective. John's criminal background provided him with insights into how organized crime operated, while his experience as a legitimate lawman had taught him how to serve justice within moral boundaries. Catherine's education and social skills opened doors that would have remained closed to a lone wolf operator. Together, they developed a reputation as problem solvers who could handle situations that stumped traditional authorities. Communities began quietly requesting their assistance with criminal problems that seemed beyond local law enforcement capabilities. Federal agents, while unable to officially sanction their activities, began providing unofficial cooperation when their investigations aligned with government interests. The work was dangerous and demanding, requiring constant vigilance and careful planning to avoid recognition or capture. But it also provided John with something he'd never experienced during his years as either outlaw or official lawman: the satisfaction of serving justice without the complications of political pressures or jurisdictional limitations. More than that, the partnership with Catherine had given him the family connection he'd lost when he killed his brother in New Mexico. She'd become more than a working partner. She was the daughter he'd never had, someone who understood his past without being defined by it, who could see the man he was trying to become rather than the criminal he'd once been. Their success inevitably attracted attention from federal authorities who were curious about the mysterious problem solvers operating throughout the territories. Deputy Marshal Crawford, the same investigator who'd exposed John's deception in Redemption Creek, began tracking reports of their activities with growing interest and suspicion. Crawford had never forgotten the case of the fake marshal who'd vanished from Redemption Creek, leaving behind a community that mourned his departure despite learning about his criminal past. The pattern of mysterious problem-solving in frontier communities reminded him of the same combination of criminal expertise and genuine dedication to justice that had characterized Black Jack Morrison's service as Marshal William Cade. The investigation that followed was more sophisticated than anything John had faced during his outlaw years. Crawford used modern investigative techniques, coordinating with local law enforcement agencies and utilizing the growing telegraph network to track patterns of criminal activity resolution across multiple territories. The breakthrough came when a former gang member recognized John in a Colorado mining town, despite the years that had passed and the changes he'd made to his appearance. The man was facing execution for murder and saw informing on Black Jack Morrison as his only chance to avoid the gallows. Federal authorities moved quickly once they had credible evidence of John's location and activities. A team of experienced manhunters was assembled, led by Crawford himself, with orders to capture the most wanted outlaw in territorial history. The net began closing around John and Catherine as they worked to resolve a range war in Wyoming that had already claimed dozens of lives. The final confrontation, when it came, wasn't the violent shootout that might have been expected from Black Jack Morrison's legendary reputation. Instead, it was a quiet conversation in a hotel room in Cheyenne, where John Morrison surrendered himself to federal custody rather than endanger Catherine or the community they'd been trying to protect. Crawford, who'd spent years studying the case, approached the arrest with a mixture of professional satisfaction and genuine curiosity about the man who'd become both legend and mystery throughout the West. The conversation that followed revealed the full scope of John's activities since his disappearance from Redemption Creek, including detailed accounts of the communities he'd protected and the criminals he'd eliminated. The evidence Catherine presented on her uncle's behalf was compelling. Testimonials from dozens of communities where his intervention had saved lives and restored order, documentation of criminal organizations he'd destroyed, and proof of the anonymous charitable contributions he'd made using money from his outlaw years. But the legal system had little room for moral ambiguity or extenuating circumstances when dealing with a man who'd committed multiple murders and robberies over the course of his criminal career. Federal prosecutors were determined to make an example of Black Jack Morrison, regardless of his subsequent reformation or service to frontier communities. The trial that followed became a national sensation, pitting legal justice against moral redemption in a case that captured the imagination of Americans throughout the country. Newspapers carried daily reports of testimony from witnesses who'd known Morrison as both criminal and protector, creating a complex portrait of a man who defied simple categorization. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Morrison's crimes during his outlaw years: murders, robberies, and acts of terrorism that had terrorized the frontier for over a decade. They argued that his subsequent good deeds, while admirable, couldn't erase the debt he owed to society for his crimes. The defense, led by Catherine with the help of prominent attorneys who'd been moved by her uncle's story, presented equally compelling evidence of his transformation and service. They argued that Morrison had already served justice through his years of protecting innocent people, that his contributions to frontier communities outweighed his past crimes. More controversially, they argued that the federal government had benefited from Morrison's activities as an unofficial law enforcement agent, that his work had accomplished objectives that legitimate authorities had been unable to achieve through conventional means. The testimony from Redemption Creek's residents was particularly powerful, with Mayor Henderson and other community leaders traveling to testify about the transformation Morrison had brought to their town. They spoke of a man who'd risked his life repeatedly to protect them, who'd created lasting institutions that continued to serve their community years after his departure. But perhaps the most compelling testimony came from Morrison himself, who used his time on the witness stand to accept full responsibility for his crimes while explaining the journey that had led him from outlaw to protector. He made no excuses for his criminal past, offered no justifications for the lives he'd taken or the property he'd stolen. Instead, he spoke about the gradual realization that his skills and experience could be used to protect rather than prey upon innocent people, about satisfaction he'd found in legitimate service, and about his hope that his remaining years might be used to make meaningful amends for his past crimes. The jury's deliberation lasted 3 days, reflecting the complex moral questions raised by the case. When they finally returned their verdict, it was a compromise that satisfied neither the prosecution's demand for absolute justice nor the defense's argument for redemption through service. Morrison was found guilty of his crimes and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, but the sentence was structured to recognize his subsequent reformation and service. He would be eligible for parole after 10 years, and provisions were made for him to continue his charitable contributions and educational activities while incarcerated. More significantly, the judge acknowledged in his sentencing statement that Morrison's case raised fundamental questions about the nature of justice and redemption in American society. He noted that the defendant had already served a form of justice through his years of protecting innocent people, but that legal justice required formal recognition of his crimes and punishment for his actions. The sentence was seen as both victory and defeat by observers on both sides of the case. Prosecutors had succeeded in convicting one of the most notorious outlaws in Western history, but had failed to secure the death penalty or life imprisonment they'd sought. Defense advocates had saved Morrison from execution, but had failed to secure the full recognition of his redemption they'd argued he deserved. Morrison himself accepted the verdict with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the trial. He understood that justice required him to pay a formal debt to society for his crimes, regardless of his subsequent service. The 10-year minimum sentence would allow him to continue contributing to society while acknowledging the seriousness of his past actions. Catherine, devastated by her uncle's conviction, but proud of the courage he'd shown throughout the ordeal, dedicated herself to ensuring that his story would be remembered accurately, rather than reduced to simple mythology. She wrote extensively about their years working together, documenting the communities they'd helped and the lives they'd saved. Her accounts provided a detailed record of how criminal expertise could be transformed into legitimate service, how the skills developed through years of lawlessness could be redirected toward protecting rather than exploiting innocent people. The book she eventually published became a classic study of redemption and transformation in American frontier society. Meanwhile, Morrison began serving his sentence at the federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas, where his reputation as both outlaw and protector preceded him. Prison officials, aware of his unique history, assigned him to educational programs where he could share his knowledge of frontier law enforcement with younger inmates seeking to reform their own lives. The work provided him with a sense of purpose and a way to continue serving others despite his incarceration. He became a mentor to inmates who were genuinely seeking redemption, helping them understand how criminal skills could be transformed into legitimate abilities if they were willing to make the fundamental changes in character that such transformation required. His influence extended beyond the prison walls through the continuation of his anonymous charitable contributions, administered by Catherine and other trusted associates. The money he'd stolen during his outlaw years continued to fund schools, hospitals, and other institutions throughout the West, creating a positive legacy that would outlast his lifetime. More than that, his story became an inspiration to people throughout the country who were struggling with their own moral failures and seeking paths to redemption. Letters arrived regularly from individuals who'd been moved by accounts of his transformation, people who found hope in the possibility that even the most serious mistakes might be overcome through genuine service to others. The legend of Black Jack Morrison, Marshal William Cade, and John Morrison merged into a single narrative of crime, redemption, and service that captured the imagination of Americans for generations. His story became part of the mythology of the American West, a tale that illustrated both the brutality and the possibility for transformation that characterized frontier society. Academic scholars studied his case as an example of the complex relationship between justice and redemption in American legal and social systems. Religious leaders used his story to illustrate the possibility of genuine conversion and the power of service to transform even the most hardened criminals. But perhaps most importantly, his story continued to inspire people who were seeking their own paths to redemption, individuals who found hope in the possibility that past failures didn't have to define their futures. The man who'd been both the most wanted outlaw and the most dedicated protector in territorial history had proven that human nature was capable of profound transformation when guided by genuine commitment to serving others. The legacy lived on in the communities he'd protected, in the schools and hospitals funded by his anonymous donations, and in the countless individuals who'd been inspired by his example to seek their own forms of redemption through service. The marshal who never was had become something greater than any official lawman, a symbol of the possibility that even the most broken people could find ways to heal themselves and their communities through dedication to justice and protection of the innocent. His story would echo across the American frontier for generations, reminding people that redemption was always possible for those willing to pay the price in service to others, and that true justice sometimes required looking beyond the simple categories of criminal and lawman to see the complex human being beneath the legend. That's it for today. Don't forget to hit follow, leave a like, and drop a comment so we'll have more motivation to bring you even better stories.